Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unauthorized Disclosure. I'm one of the show's hosts, Rania, Khalek, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kevin Gosztola, as well as our guest today, which we're very excited to have back on the show, I believe, for the first time this year, award-winning journalist and host of the Pushback show at the Grayzone, Aaron Maté. Welcome back, Aaron.
Thanks, guys, for having me back.
So you've had a pretty busy couple of weeks. Let's just go right into it. You recently testified at the UN Security Council about the OPCW investigation into Syrian chemical weapons attacks that were basically a false flag, essentially. And there was like all these whistleblowers that you had reported on out of the OPCW saying basically that. So why don't you just go into it and talk about it? That was a pretty big deal. I don't know if those of you who are watching have any idea that Aaron just did this, but it was a really big deal last week. We're really proud of him for doing it. There was a lot of hate and anger about it from the regime changers, which is always good. But why don't you tell us what went down?
You know, as I told a friend of mine a long time ago when she was feeling she was hating on someone else. I told her, hate is great. Hate is great. And so in this case, I feel the hate is great. People who are mad at me for doing this, I welcome it because I think this is the most important journalistic endeavor I've ever been a part of, because we're talking about lies and a cover-up and a pressure campaign to justify military strikes on Syria, and not just justify military strikes, but justify ongoing economic warfare. And this story, this OPCW story, is exposing the fraud that has been perpetrated to justify these policies. And so no wonder it's engendering so much hate from regime change, cheerleaders, and lobbyists. So for anyone who's not familiar with the story, I'll just recap quickly. April 2018, Syrian government is accused of committing this chemical weapons attack in the town of Douma. The allegation, if you look at it for a second, makes no sense. Syria was about to retake Douma from Jaish al-Islam, this extremist Saudi militia that was shelling Damascus. For Syria to then use chemical weapons would meant that they knowingly did the one thing that they knew would trigger US military intervention, because Trump had promised to enforce the red line. And in fact, he did the year prior over another, I think, dubious chemical weapons allegation in the town of Khan Sheikhoun. So even just before looking at the evidence, it was far-fetched. And then a year later, we got the evidence. At least we got the evidence when leaks started coming out from the OPCW, which found that while the OPCW had put out a report that backed the US narrative that the Syrian government was guilty of a chlorine attack, the OPCW's own inspectors had found the opposite. They had found evidence that the attack was staged, and these leaks showed that their evidence was suppressed, that the inspectors who collected the evidence and wrote a report based on it were basically taken off the case. They were sidelined. And that faulty science that ignored all the key facts was presented to the public. So this is a cover-up. And we also found out that this was done under US government pressure, because a US delegation visited the OPCW during the investigation and told these inspectors what to say, which is a direct act of pressure and intimidation. Because, by the way, not only are state parties not allowed to interfere in OPCW investigations, they're also not allowed to even know who the inspectors are, because the anonymity of these inspectors grants them protection so that nobody can try to threaten them or coerce them or try to influence them. So this is a huge scandal, and it's come out with a series of leaks. And amazingly, it's been totally ignored in the Western media, although I guess we shouldn't be surprised by that anymore, because we live in a society where the media functions so often as a propaganda arm of the state. And so the latest phase of this was a series of UN Security Council meetings, and Russia and China convened this special meeting of the UN Security Council under a mechanism known as the ARIA formula. And they invited me to speak along with Ted Postol, the eminent MIT professor emeritus, physicist, former Pentagon advisor. And most importantly, they invited one of the inspectors, Ian Henderson, who was on the Douma team, went to Syria for the mission, wrote up a report that was suppressed and that reached the exact opposite of what the OPCW put out publicly. So I spoke just laying out the facts, the known facts about the case, and the response was really funny. The assembled diplomats had no interest at all in hearing anything that we had to say. And it's fine if you want to dismiss me. I mean, I'm a journalist with the Grayzone, not very established. I won an Uzi award, but that probably doesn't impress very many people beyond leftists. Certainly doesn't impress UN ambassadors. Fine. But Ian Henderson was there, a guy who was on the Douma mission, who took part in the investigation under discussion. And they didn't engage with a single fact that he said. They either ignored him or accused him of spreading disinformation, which is so funny to say about someone who conducted the investigation. As Henderson said, none of these ambassadors have his expertise, and none of them ever went to Syria for this investigation. So what was funny was seeing the degree to which they were willing to malign him and ignore him. And of course, also interesting to see the way this story, this explosive story, continues to be totally ignored in the Western media.
It's really incredible, right? Because, like, you know, the narrative about the Iraq War, the WMDs being a lie, has kind of been established. Nobody, nobody attacks you for saying that anymore, right? But somehow with Syria, people just turn their brains off, and like, this is like as explosive as it gets. You have another bombing campaign that was based on a lie, according to the experts who were sent to go investigate it, and then that was suppressed. Like, this is about more than just Syria at this point. You know what the journalism you've done around this, and what these experts like Ted Postol and others have demonstrated is that you can't trust an organization that's supposed to be, unbiased to carry out an investigation, because it's like the U.S. and its allies are way too powerful and able to pressure them to reach the conclusions that will lead to war. So how can we ever trust the OPCW to investigate anything when it comes to a country that the State Department wants to overthrow?
Yeah, and accordingly, I cannot believe how censored this story has become. I've never seen anything like it. Imagine if we found out that the Iraq WMD thing was a scam, but nobody reported it.
Mm-hmm.
If there were whistleblowers and nobody reported it. It's basically
there were some people trying to say it was a scam, and they were sidelined and their careers were destroyed. John Bolton, as we know, there was that one diplomat who John Bolton like chased out of his job.
Listen, Rania, on this point, there's actually a very strong symbolism here, where that diplomat was José Bustani,
mm-hmm.
who was the OPCW's first director general. So as you say, Bolton personally threatened him, said to him, "We know where your kids live." And then the US engineered his ouster as OPCW chief because he was getting in the way of the Iraq war.
Right.
Fast forward 18 years later, just this week, José Bustani returned on the international stage when he came to another UN Security Council meeting a week after the one that I spoke at. And he came to speak in defense of the OPCW whistleblowers and to call on his former organization to let them be heard. And what happened? The US and its allies blocked José Bustani's testimony. They would not let him testify. And so we obtained it at the Grayzone and we published it. And I recommend people watch it or read it. But what makes this all the more poignant is that the person who threatened José Bustani and got him ousted in 2002 was John Bolton. Well, who was the US government official who oversaw the US government bombing of Syria based on the Douma allegation, and then was also there in office when a US government delegation then went to the OPCW a few months later and told them what to say? It was John Bolton. So once again, John Bolton and José Bustani are on opposite sides here. But then once again, our media is taking the side, or at least this time I should say, the media is taking the side of John Bolton in refusing to acknowledge and look at just why is the US blocking the testimony of the OPCW's first director general? Why aren't they interested in hearing what he has to say? What could that mean? Is it possible that they're covering something up here? But nothing. There's no interest. Even from leftist outlets, like The Intercept has not acknowledged the OPCW whistleblowers' existence yet. Democracy Now! Has acknowledged them, but has only a couple of times, has mostly ignored the story. And the only times they've acknowledged them, the first time they had on this guy, Brian Whitaker, who's a Syria proxy war apologist, who later tried to dox one of the whistleblowers and expose him and put him in danger. And they recently then had a headline about Bustani, but totally getting the story wrong. And their headline said that the UN blocked Bustani's testimony, which is false. It was the US and its allies that blocked Bustani's testimony at the UN. So we have, across the spectrum, the censorship campaign on the Trump administration's behalf, which is so ironic for a media that prides itself on opposing Trump. This could be a huge scandal if they wanted it to be. Democrats can make this very big. Trump administration bombing a country on false grounds.
The Democrats supported bombing that country, right? The Syria policy was initially a Democratic policy.
Absolutely, and that's why acknowledging this story is so anathema. Why nobody can do it, because it would violate a bipartisan policy, and it would raise questions. Okay, well, if this was a fraud, what else that we've been told about Syria has been a fraud in the name of justifying, 10 years of military and economic warfare?
And these, I mean, to be clear, these chemical attacks that are being called into question are repeatedly being invoked to justify, like you said, the economic war on Syria, right? Like, a lot of people think the war on Syria is over. The U.S. has stopped, the U.S. and its allies are no longer arming and funding this collection of jihadist groups to take over various areas and try to collapse the state. But what they are doing is they have launched economic terrorism against Syria. They've completely destroyed the Syrian economy with some of the most severe sanctions in history. And they've made the country unlivable. A lot of people that I know from Syria, when I used to visit, don't live there anymore because they try to get out because there's no future there when there's no economy. There's no jobs. The currency's collapsing. Everything's decaying and falling apart because the government can't afford to, maintain bridges and roads anymore. The basic things that you need from a government, the U.S. won't allow anyone to do any business with Syria anywhere to help the country rebuild. So you just have these neighborhoods that sit in like rubble. So there's just not much hope for any sort of future, despite the fighting ending. And so this is all being invoked and used to justify this economic war across the EU and the US.
Exactly. And
like the Caesar sanctions, sorry. Like,
yeah.
if you want to talk about that a little bit as well, like these Caesar sanctions are all based on, something else that your colleague Max Blumenthal has reported on, this, which is just this massive lobbying campaign coordinated by these Gulf-funded, State Department-connected groups.
Yeah, when you're an empire, but you rule in a nominal democracy, you need to be able to manufacture consent, as Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman wrote about. And the way to do that when you're targeting states that you want to destroy because they're in the way of your empire, of your hegemony, because they want to chart their own path, is by relentless propaganda. So in the 1980s, the Reagan administration told us that Nicaragua was a national security threat to the U.S. because it was only a few days drive from Texas, as if the Sandinistas were going to invade Texas. Go through the line, Iraq, the first Gulf War, we had to invade Iraq because Iraqi soldiers were ripping out babies from incubators in Kuwait. I mean, there's all sorts of humanitarian propaganda that justify atrocities, our own destruction of these countries. Libya, Gaddafi's troops were given Viagra to commit mass rape. I mean, and Syria is no different. You've had just nonstop deceptions, as you, Rania, and Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton and other independent journalists, Dan Cohen at the Grayzone, have all documented long before I ever entered this story, to dupe people and to convince them to ignore the reality of what's going on, which is, our own role in fueling a devastating proxy war, one of the most expensive programs in CIA history, if the New York Times is to be believed. And yeah, the latest phase of this is these Caesar sanctions. And look, try to find an outlet that's reported on that in the U.S. On the
at least in an honest way,
in an honest
as opposed
way.
to in a justified kind of way.
Yeah, in an honest way. But you look on the left, people, Rania, I mean, you experienced this far more harshly than I did. People got so duped by the propaganda around this, which I understand. I kind of bought into some of it too for a bit until I did some reading, and I was like, holy shit, this is like an unbelievable scandal. And you guys, Max and Ben, were totally right.
We weren't always either. Like,
you weren't. It's true.
Like me, Max, and Ben all had The Syria was probably one of the most heavily propagandized wars. I think it was the first social media war, right? Like we didn't have social media during the Iraq War.
Absolutely.
We had it during Syria, and Syria wasn't like the Iraq War. We weren't sending thousands of American troops to go in, occupy this country and invade it and bomb it. We were doing it through proxy forces. So it was much more like what we did in Latin America in the 80s with like death squads. So it was like this information warfare. And it was really like all of us were misled. And that's why all of us were attacked so heavily, like the last 3 years, maybe longer, the last 4 years, have just been attacked for trying to expose that just to the left, right? Like it's not like we're on MSNBC or CNN here, like just for trying to expose it, like so people at Jacobin understand what's happening in Syria, is what got us attacked. So you can imagine how much higher the stakes are for mainstream journalists, which is why a lot of them self-censor on this issue, much like they used to do with Israel-Palestine.
Exactly. And these Caesar sanctions now are so criminal, so sadistic. You know, you read the act itself, the text of the law, and it says its explicit strategy is to block reconstruction. Imagine that. A country that we've helped destroy, we're now going to use our financial power around the world to prevent it from rebuilding itself. It's unbelievable. And look at the attention paid to it in the US. It's just it's par for the course. Meanwhile, we're fear-mongering about Russian social media ads being a threat to our democracy. And we're preventing Syria from importing, you know, the goods it needs to rebuild. Cement.
Syria from importing
cement. I recently saw an article about a Syrian doctor who had to smuggle parts to repair a CT scanner in his hospital in Syria because they're not allowed to bring it in. It's just savage. And I
just wanted to add to what you're saying. This is a country, by the way, that before this war had one of the best healthcare systems in the region, free universal access to healthcare. It was one of the few countries that was still like had this functioning state. But go on. I just wanted to.
Well, you know, I read that recently in a UN report because there was a UN report about sanctions, and it noted that Syria before the war had the best healthcare in the region, and it just. This is the crime that was committed there. I'm still wrapping my head around it because it's so severe. I'm getting a window into the deception required to pull it off by covering this OPCW story. Because look, this is not just a matter of like competing theories. These are whistleblowers. We're supposed to worship whistleblowers and defend them. That's the message I've been hearing about Trump for the last 4 years, that we defend whistleblowers and they're our heroes. These are whistleblowers who are exposing a bigger crime than almost anything else that Trump has been accused of, which is bombing a country illegally and then pressuring a global watchdog to cover it up. But yet these whistleblowers are being silenced, and they're even being silenced again. I'm sorry to harp on this, but it's upsetting. And it's actually dangerous, I think, for these whistleblowers that even adversarial progressive websites are ignoring them. The fact that a website like The Intercept won't even acknowledge their existence, because if no one's willing to cover the story, then that lowers the cost of any harm being done to these people, these brave people who are defending themselves and who have been defamed. So it's just morally and intellectually so maddening, and such a window into how the media works here and how cowardly so many people are, that you have this. It's not a matter of like, you know, which argument is right. These are just facts. These people were at the OPCW. They claim this. You can at least acknowledge that. You don't have to even accept all their scientific findings and evidence. I don't even care about that. Just acknowledge their existence. But people are not. But they're not being acknowledged because acknowledging their existence would blow a hole in the entire narrative that was used to justify this criminal proxy war. It's upsetting.
And then Aaron, I have a colleague who I just spent the last month covering the Julian Assange extradition trial with, Tariq Khadad, who tried to, I believe, explore this for Newsweek, and the message was sent loud and clear to him that there was not going to be space within the pages online of Newsweek to cover this. So I think we also have to acknowledge from the top down that there have been some individuals potentially we don't know about, that we may not know about, who looked at this privately and then thought, I'd like to keep my job at this media organization, and so I'm going to not become Tariq Khadad and be forced out of this mainstream media organization where I have this position.
That's right. But, people like Amy Goodman at Democracy Now!, my former boss, who I learned a lot from, she doesn't have to worry about that. No one's going to fire her. No one's going to fire Betsy Reed at The Intercept.
Right.
If she covers this.
Who we know has played a gatekeeper role in keeping Syria coverage.
And Russiagate coverage too. Betsy, unfortunately, I used to know Betsy, is a diehard Russiagate Kool-Aid drinker. She believes there was collusion and has refused to, I think, look at the evidence, which is disappointing for an editor of an adversarial website. And yet they refuse to acknowledge these people's existence. So it's not just, certainly I don't fault people who are low in the chain, who are coming up in their career. It's true, if you cover the story now, I don't fault you for it. But if you're in a position of power where you're protected and you're supposed to be adversarial and you're not, and you're helping cover up a Trump crime, to me, it's just inexcusable. And I've tried to lobby both DN and The Intercept behind the scenes, but it hasn't worked. So I'm trying to shame them now publicly, because sometimes shame is the only thing that works. I don't like being like the nag, but so actually maybe I should say I do. I guess there's a part of me that does like it, the self-righteous part of me. But
not with people that you've worked with, have like some sort of relationship with that you like as people. It's like you don't want to be in the position, and that's what the position they put us in, right? Is like then we have to be like, hey, I really like you, but you suck on this, and you're really doing a disservice to the journalistic profession.
That's the unfortunate reality, and it's disappointing. I mean, what could be a bigger story than a bombing a country based on false allegations and then compromising a global watchdog to cover it up? It's a huge story, and you have whistleblowers. We're supposed to love whistleblowers. These leaks came out at WikiLeaks, right? All the documents are there at WikiLeaks. Adversarial outlets love WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has fueled entire news cycles. Amy Goodman speaks out in defense of Julian Assange and speaks out how we need to challenge power and challenge war, challenge the lies that lead to war. This is all stuff I learned from Amy being at DN for 10 years. And she used to do it. She used to cover Syria, I think, actually pretty accurately. She used to and cover Russia as well pretty accurately. But something has changed in the few years since I've left. And it's a part of a growing shift on the left where Russiagate played a major role, where it's pushed liberal leftists to the right. It's made being a Cold War hawk synonymous with opposing Trump, that if you want to oppose Trump, you have to basically oppose anything Russia does and believe this fantasy that Trump does Russia's bidding and that him and Putin are in cahoots. And buy into this narrative that anything that challenges the sort of centrist Cold Warrior establishment is Russian disinformation. And Syria is a big part of that. And I think Syria, by the way, plays a major role, or at least a role, in why we have Russiagate, because when Trump was elected, he was calling for scaling back the proxy war. He was speaking out against it. And I think, and he was bringing in someone like Michael Flynn, who, as head of the DIA, had kind of undermined the proxy war because his DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, wrote a report pointing out the people we were supporting and who were fighting Assad was essentially Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And the people who were trying to use Al-Qaeda and ISIS to defeat Assad didn't like that. Mm-hmm. So I think you can partly explain Russiagate. You can directly tie it to the Syrian proxy war. And even if there isn't a direct tie, certainly this weapon of basically labeling anything that centrist neoliberals and national security state officials don't like as Russian disinformation has played a role in helping to dissuade people from looking at places like Syria accurately. But nothing can justify ignoring these whistleblowers. Nothing. It's insane.
Well, and then Aaron, I'd like to ask you about the behavior of these diplomats at the UN Security Council, which so offended Ted Postol. Apparently one of them at least had, we could presume, a staffer sifting through your Twitter account, doing the kind of like Hamilton Project, disinformation, I put in air quote, analysis that has become popularized during the Russiagate era. And I think there are two issues that you could address, which is one, this very concern that Ian Henderson has that no matter what he does, it's going to be lost in the mix of this geopolitics that exists in the world, that no matter what, and you know, obviously you could take issue with his attempt to remain neutral and maybe not see what China and Russia are trying to do that could be of positive benefit, but he really seems to be caught in the middle here between U.S. empire and then the adversaries that the U.S. empire has designated as their own enemies. And so it makes it difficult for the truth of what has happened to be broken through. And it makes it hard to deal with the deficiencies at OPCW and to deal with the politicization of the OPCW. And I think that's how he feels. That's what I take from watching his testimony, that he feels this powerlessness of what can I do having this career to redeem this agency that has become a captive of the U.S. government. And then you also mentioned in your coverage of this and in following what had happened, that Ian Henderson broke some news about how this file was left, that there was this idea that this file was going to be left open to keep pressuring Syria over their chemical weapons program, even after they destroyed all the chemical weapons. So can you highlight that as well?
Yeah, so the treatment of Ian Henderson was just startling because, you know, as I think I said before, if you want to insult me, if you want to insult my Twitter account, as the UK ambassador did, and I think that just speaks ill of the UK ambassador, the fact that he can't challenge me on the facts. So instead he tries to dismiss me by saying that my Twitter account says everything we need to know about the reliability or the independence of my reporting. That's what he said. He said the contents of his Twitter accounts tells us everything we need to know about the independence of his reporting. As I said, I'm not sure what my Twitter account has to do with anything, but even if I have a bad Twitter account, that's fine. I'm not sure, that has nothing to do with whether or not this OPCW investigation was compromised or the facts at hand. So, you know, but it's fine though if you want to dismiss me. I mean, I lay out the facts, you can take them or not. But certainly, I'm not an expert in science. I just have the reporting I've done. But then you have Ian Henderson, who was actually on the ground in Douma, who is a veteran, celebrated OPCW official. He's been with the OPCW since its founding in 1997. He did one term of service. He came back because his skills were in such high demand. And that's why he went to Douma, because they needed him. They actually added him to the team late because they realized he was so needed. So he came into Syria after the others had already gotten there. And here he is at this meeting, and the assembled distinguished diplomats from the US, UK, France, the countries that had bombed Syria, based on the allegations that Henderson is now challenging, and their allies, Germany, Canada, everybody else, are just ignoring him, or they're insulting him, and they're accusing him of having incomplete information. But nobody challenges him on the facts. And they're basically following the same tack as the OPCW, which has accused Henderson of going rogue and all this stuff, but they can't challenge him on the actual merits. And at the end, Henderson spoke about how disappointed he was, but that also just the reality that we live in, where people don't have the minimal integrity and courage to stand up for facts, for the truth, and for the independence of the OPCW, and for the legitimacy of a independent scientific inquiry. They just can't do it because it's an inconvenient political narrative. They need it to justify their warfare on Syria. And so Henderson spoke very eloquently on that. And we posted his remarks at the Grayzone.com, which people can go check out. And then he also revealed some new news that, as you mentioned, Kevin, that where this mechanism at the UN, at the OPCW, called the DAT, which was used to enforce Syria's compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention after it destroyed its chemical weapons arsenal. Which, by the way, speaks to another sad irony of all of this, that, you know, the OPCW 7 years ago won the Nobel Peace Prize. And unlike, you know, Henry Kissinger or other people who, or Barack Obama, who had no business being awarded a peace medal, the OPCW deserved it because they won it in part for their efforts to destroy Syria's chemical weapons. And the reason that they won it is because in a moment of rare cooperation between the US and Russia, these two powers, which were on the opposing sides in Syria, worked together to broker a deal to destroy Syria's chemical weapons, which happened after another chemical weapons deception. This was in Ghouta in August 2013, where, again, similar to Douma, just as Assad is winning a battle, all of a sudden he gets accused of committing this chemical attack in Ghouta, a chemical attack that did happen. Sarin was used, and many people were killed. And by the way, it happened just as he had also just recently invited OPCW inspectors into the country. So think about that. Think about that. You've invited OPCW inspectors into the country, and right when they're there, you commit a chemical weapons attack. Right when they're there to investigate. It just, it makes absolutely no sense. And then we found out through the reporting of Seymour Hersh, all these damning revelations that U.S. intelligence had concluded that al-Nusra in Syria had acquired sarin from Turkey, that the sarin that was used in Ghouta was tested by Porter Down, the British military laboratory, and they had found that the sarin in Ghouta was different than the sarin that the Syrian government had in its arsenal, that Turkish officials had discussed some kind of false flag operation to draw in the U.S. to enforce the chemical weapons red line. And this is presumably why Obama, after saying he was going to bomb Syria, why he backtracked. And we later learned that James Clapper, who was then Obama's director of national intelligence, went to Obama and said, the intelligence here is not a slam dunk. It was a very deliberate reference to the Iraq WMD scam, where George Tenet famously said that our intelligence here is a slam dunk to George W. Bush. So from that, you have this amazing achievement involving the OPCW, this achievement for peace and for global cooperation, where the OPCW wins a Nobel Peace Prize. And now the OPCW gets exploited to then basically undo that legacy, to use the OPCW to justify warfare on Syria. And Henderson is saying that the DAT, the very mechanism to enforce that chemical weapons agreement that destroyed Syria's arsenal, using that to also make allegations against Syria. Because what he said was that when he was at the OPCW and they were talking about the DAT file, what he heard was them saying was that no matter what Syria does, keep the file open and keep the pressure on Syria. And the inference there is that so the DAT could be used, just like the OPCW's Douma investigation was used to justify Western warfare on Syria.
All right, so we're going to lose Rania here. She's got something to run off to and do. But before I lose her, I wanted to put something to both of you involving a major crisis that seems to be happening at the U.S. Agency for Global Media. They are apparently dealing with the fact that they are becoming more and more of a propaganda arm of the U.S. government. And there have been some whistleblowers who say that the Trump administration is making it harder for them to do their work. And the reason I bring this up is because, of course, Rania is at In the Now, where they've been labeled a Russia state-affiliated media organization, and they refuse to label this organization that like the Voice of America and the other broadcasters under this umbrella, under this state media agency as such, that they are U.S. state affiliated media. And I'd like to ask you, Rania, do you think that Twitter and Facebook should do a review of the outlets to determine their state of their editorial independence, just like apparently you've been subject to? You have to prove a lot about your organization in order to exist and not be targeted unfairly. And then Aaron, you can comment on this as well if you would like.
So, my media organization, the parent company, is called Mafic, and we weren't subject to any sort of editorial review. We're actually suing Facebook to try and get them to have somebody come in and review the editorial independence of our organization, which used to be 50% owned by Reply, which is a part of RT, but no longer is. So even on that basis, I completely disagree with this label being put on, even an organization like Reply, but it's even more wrong to put it on my organization because we don't actually have that ownership anymore. But yeah, it's the Twitter and Facebook labels are state controlled, which is crazy. And it's only applied to anything that's deemed to be Russian, or I think they did it with Chinese media as well, and that's it. And as Aaron noticed, they even applied this label to a completely independent, was never connected to any sort of state affiliated media outlet. I don't remember what it was called, but there's like a French independent media outlet that was given the Russia label on Twitter, and they were like, dude, like we've never had a relationship ever with anything affiliated with Russia. So it's completely biased, obviously, and completely false in the case of my company. And I would say that like an organization, all of these organizations attached to Voice of America, these were always propagandistic and always in line with U.S. State Department goals. It even says it if you look at their websites that they're like that's a part of their reason for existing, is to like be like a soft power arm of the U.S. I think the difference here is that these kinds of outlets were never like forced to pick a side, Republican or Democrat, and so now that's what you see the Trump administration trying to impose, not just that you have to be in line with U.S. foreign policy, but now you have to be in line with supporting Donald Trump as president, which I think is what's different. But anyways, you'll never see these organizations labeled because it's completely double standard, biased, BS. And I hope people can see through it. And, we're talking about some of the problems with the left. One thing that I've noticed with the left is they don't care. A lot of these outlets, these independent outlets, should be the most worried about this labeling, because it's literally applied as of now. Depends on how the lawsuit with Facebook goes with my company, but as of now, Facebook is arguing that it's a matter of opinion. They don't actually have to prove that you're controlled by Russia or controlled by China. It's just a matter of opinion. So if that's the case and they win this lawsuit, they can go around labeling whatever they want. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. They can go label the Grayzone or shadow proof as Venezuelan state controlled or Chinese state controlled or Russia state controlled, and they don't even have to be right. They just say it's an opinion. So it's really alarming and troubling, and a shame that no one's really covering it.
I agree. I don't think I have anything to add that would be useful more than that. I totally agree with you. It's insane, and it just speaks to, it's one more way in which our media operates so much as a function of propaganda of the state, while ironically claiming to care about and feeling outraged about what it deems to be propaganda of other states. It's just the irony abounds.
And also, like, these social media giants are doing this on behalf of the US government. They're adding warning labels to outlets that the State Department doesn't like, because those outlets are offering a narrative that challenges what you are hearing from the State Department. And I think that's one of the benefits, actually, to foreign media. I think people should have a diversity of where they consume media from.
Absolutely.
I think
especially when, just going back to what I was saying before, the sites that are supposed to be adversarial and different from corporate media here are doing the exact same coverage, whether it's Russiagate or Syria. I mean, there's been such as like a convergence of perspectives and a shutting out of dissent, where sometimes the only places that will cover stories that matter, especially of global importance, are outlets like RT or other foreign sites.
Exactly. And, when it comes to even outlets like Iran's press TV, I'm not going to expect to hear like anything really challenging of the Iranian government on press TV. But I think it's important, given that the US is trying to overthrow the government in Iran and is sanctioning that country, to be able to see the Iranian perspective. And YouTube repeatedly keeps deleting and erasing the accounts, as well as Twitter, of press TV at the behest of the US government, basically calling it propaganda. But it's literally just trying to shut out the Iranian take. Like, we should be hearing the Iranian take.
Of course we should. Unless we're totalitarians who can't tolerate other people's points of view, dissenting points of view. I mean, it's like what anybody who supports any of this is essentially saying that they're tolerating totalitarianism. We're not going to allow dissenting points of view. That's what it is. And people shouldn't have to think about it for a second. And again, it's the same thing with why the OPCW story is silenced. Is you cannot tolerate facts that undermine narratives that are used to justify your own power. And that's unfortunate with so many people. That's what, underpinning all of this is this feeling of American supremacy. That's what fills these people's egos and gives them a reason to live, instead of like love and family and being a good person. A lot of people operate on this feeling of supremacy and that they need to dominate other countries and feel superior and
Or
pretend America is the best.
Or, I think that's something that's so dangerous. This goes actually back to Russiagate. Again, a lot of this ends up connecting back to Russiagate. And Aaron, you mentioned the sort of rightward shift of even like left media because of Russiagate. And I think that the sort of acceptance of this suppression of foreign views, right? Foreign viewpoints isn't necessarily because the people, because like progressives, because some progressives support this kind of stuff. It's not necessarily because they don't want to hear dissenting opinions. It's because this narrative of fear mongering about the ability of the Russians or the Iranians to actually influence the outcome of the US election is like the guiding principle, right? At the end of the day, people really believe that. They really, really believe that like we need to be protected online from anything that comes from a place that, is Chinese or Russian or Iranian, because all of this is literally going to get Donald Trump elected or is going to keep people home from voting or something.
It's the intellectual equivalent of a kid fearing a monster under the bed.
Yeah.
Even if everything that Russia is accused of is true. So stealing some emails and putting up some dumb social media ads that nobody saw. The idea that this could influence an election or even a couple of voters, I think is just ridiculous. And what this is actually for is all this fear mongering about disinformation is really a disinformation campaign.
Yeah.
Aimed at
the irony.
Absolving Democrats of their loss in 2016, of justifying tensions towards Russia, of justifying censorship of dissenting voices. It all has a political use. None of it's not based on anything real. I mean, even now, what's funny is when they talk about Russian interference in 2020, they don't even say what it is. It's just this like amorphous, undefined being that we don't even need to define anymore.
Yeah, does it mean Russia got Trump elected? Does it mean Russia like actually spoke with Trump and colluded with him? Does it mean that Russia told people to go vote for Trump? What the fuck? It's like, yeah, at the end of the day, it doesn't even mean anything anymore.
I mean, the only thing they cite is like they say that Russian media is saying some mean things about Joe Biden. Who cares? Do massive Americans watch Russian media, especially in Russia?
But even if Americans were, that's my favorite is when they're like, here's what Russian, Russian state media in Russia that's in Russian is saying about Joe Biden. It's like no one in America is watching that. How's that election interference?
Yeah. And look, and because so many lefty adversarial outlets haven't done their jobs, it's meant that like for some people like Chris Hedges or Lee Camp, who are on RT, like their adversarial perspectives are not welcome in other lefty spaces. So RT is a place that airs them. And so thus there's even more of an interest by warmongers to silence them. You do that through censorship and defamation, as you're experiencing now. So it's completely cynical, and it's just so anti-intellectual because they don't even bother even telling us what the supposed Russian interference is now. And by the way, they pulled the exact same thing in the 2018 midterms. There were some headlines before the 2018 midterms and like a couple of days of like, hysterical news cycles of like the warning lights are blinking red of Russian interference in the midterms. And, Jennifer Rubin was writing columns like we're defenseless against Russian interference in 2018. No one then defined what it is. And of course, when it didn't happen, there was nothing. Everyone just forgot about it because it's not based on anything real. In the same way that a kid thinks there's a monster under a bed, these grown adults invent that there's a monster under the bed. The difference is that this monster under the bed is being done for a concerted, cynical interest of protecting the power of people who want to silence dissent and want to demonize Russia, and giving them more powers to silence dissenting opinion by painting them as just agents of Russian disinformation. So it's a perfect racket. It's a perfect privilege protection racket.
And Rania had to run off, so I just have a few things before we wrap. So my interest in this story is from covering whistleblowers, and these are clearly state-identified whistleblowers that are registering these complaints. I don't doubt that they have a complaint here about the functioning of this state media agency in the U.S. government. But there is something I want to raise here because I think you might have a comment, Aaron, even if you haven't been following this that closely, which is that they talk about the journalistic independence that is being jeopardized. However, this pretense of this agency functioning as just, standard normal journalists is hard for me to accept, because one of the complaints that is part of the protected disclosure that they're saying they were retaliated against for making involves the spreading of quote unquote internet freedom tools in Hong Kong, which I undoubtedly feel is a way of just antagonizing China and stirring up tensions. And so that can't really be, a neutral or standard form of journalism. I mean, I'm not, in my standard practices of covering, I'm not agitating other countries deliberately through the spreading of internet tools or whatever.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. I don't have much more insight to add to that, Kevin. I totally agree with you.
Okay, so it's just something I wanted to insert in about the story, and again, this is the umbrella company that is over Voice of America. It's not that big of a thing that people should follow, but it did make mainstream attention, because mainstream coverage, because we're talking about the same kind of whistleblowers like the Ukraine call whistleblower, that these people who get deified for standing up to Donald Trump, who I think there's some questions as to like whether they actually should be celebrated or not. The last thing one of the last couple of things that I wanted to get into the show here, and unfortunately Rania is not around to engage with this, but I wanted to ask you about, I don't know how much you were able to follow the ruling about the Bank of England with Venezuela.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get in here that there was this ruling and see if you had any comment on the issue that seems to arise, which is, and I mean, maybe you don't even really need this ruling to get into it. It is kind of an interesting thing here. So they don't have access to their gold, and the issue that this UK court ruled, I believe it was the High Court of Justice, I want to say, it was on appeal, and the thing that they said was they don't actually know what the UK government's position is anymore on Juan Guaido, and they actually don't know what the position is on whether they recognize or feel that because Maduro hasn't left office that they still have to implicitly recognize his existence as president. It was kind of an awkward thing, but they passed it back to the lower court to get clarification from the UK government on what they feel about Guaido. I guess in general, if you don't want to talk specifically about the ruling, I mean, where are we at here from these governments around the world that keep pretending like Juan Guaido is president, even though he can't even get into the National Assembly anymore?
Well, I mean, again, similar to the Syria sanctions we talked about before and the U.S. and its allies' control of the OPCW, this is just a case where the U.S., when it tries to achieve its hegemonic goals, does so with coercion and bullying and acting like a mafia don. So at the UN, when José Bustani wanted to speak, when Ian Henderson was speaking, these people just, in the case of Bustani, blocked him from speaking. In the case of Henderson, just ignored him. And so that just operates around the world. So in Venezuela, they're trying to overthrow Venezuela. They try to do it through murderous sanctions, denying Venezuelan kids food and medicine, trying to destroy Venezuela's economy. They've had success on that front, if you want to use that term. And now an attempt at a British court to challenge that. Venezuela did win a first round, but I wouldn't put much hope in it because it's going to be appealed. I think some language will be fudgeted to legalistically evade the sovereign rights of the Venezuelan government. So I wouldn't put much hope in it. It does show that there are, it is important to try to challenge this stuff at the legal level. But the U.S. is such a hegemon that these things rarely succeed. And the only way to break that is if our media does its job. And just like in the case of the Syria whistleblowers, where's the coverage been of a Trump administration attempt to overthrow a sovereign government in Venezuela, of these murderous sanctions that kill people, thousands of people, according to the Center for Economic and Policy Research? Mark Weisbrot has done studies on this. It's just not covered. And even again, also in lefty adversarial media, you don't hear about it very much, even though this is a international crime, trying to overthrow a government and kill its people to make them suffer enough into submission so that they rise up against the government too. It's just criminal, but yet because we're living in a Russiagate era where the left has been pushed so much to the right, where the centrist liberals who've held on to power in the Democratic Party support Trump's policies, we don't hear any pushback to it. So the only hope really is for those of us who care about facts and truth and not killing people because they stand in the way of US imperialism, to do our job and try to raise awareness about this issue. And hopefully, if Trump is defeated, maybe Biden can be pushed to end this horrendous policy. Although right now, by all indications, he will try to continue it. But I do think there's a stronger chance if people can be mobilized of stopping it under Biden than it would be under Trump, who, Trump won't pay attention to anybody on the left, and the left won't even be able to organize because we'll be so busy resisting the Trump onslaught again in the second term. So if Biden wins, maybe, and people can be organized, maybe things can change.
And one more thing to get in here when we're talking about U.S. hegemony, one thing that I've been has piqued my interest because it came up during Julian Assange's extradition trial is this fact that Mike Pompeo and the State Department and the larger Trump administration has issued these sanctions against the International Criminal Court. I don't know how much you've looked at that, but I want to throw that out here as context for what we saw with you and Ian Henderson and everybody at the UN Security Council, because because this court granted a ruling that was favorable to survivors of torture and war crimes or people who were victims of war crimes in Afghanistan, just because they issued a favorable decision and agreed to go forward with investigating Afghanistan war crimes by all parties, by the way, not just one, but because it could implicate the United States government and coalition forces that have been there waging war for the last 2 decades now, very nearly 2 decades. They panicked, and Mike Pompeo issued these incredible, I think, almost unprecedented kind of sanctions against one of the investigators that is involved in doing this work. And it means that people who associate with this individual can be in trouble. And it seems to model the way that they go after Iran and Syria in the way that they're targeting the ICC. So I don't know if you have anything to add to comment about this escalation here as it relates to U.S. foreign policy, and then we'll wrap the show.
Yeah, this is how the U.S. operates, as I said before, as a mafia don, by bullying and intimidating anybody that stands in its way. And I just want to get back to the OPCW whistleblowers here, and I just want to encourage anybody watching or listening to, if there's a media outlet that you like, that you listen to frequently, especially Democracy Now! Or The Intercept, which I think if they would cover this story, it could possibly be impactful. It could help enter the mainstream, because often it's the outlets at the margins that then trickle up, that the outlets above them start to pay attention. But if even adversarial outlets at the outer limit of leftist adversarial journalism are censoring the whistleblowers, and the story has no hope. And the importance of the story goes beyond Syria. If the story can get attention, these whistleblowers have the facts on their side. And just the fact that they were censored is a huge story in itself, no matter even what the facts are. So if this story can get attention, it would have implications beyond Syria, because it marks a serious challenge to the US domination of the world system, whether it's through warfare, military-wise, or through warfare economic-wise, as has happened in Syria, where they've used this chemical weapons attack allegation to justify all that. And these inspectors are also just worthy of supporting because they're brave people. We're supposed to support whistleblowers. So I just want to encourage anybody who cares about challenging hegemony and supporting whistleblowers to contact your favorite media outlet and encourage them politely to cover this story.
And I suppose as we conclude, I should mention WikiLeaks marked 14 years that they've been doing work. And of course, as you said earlier, they published the OPCW documents. Even while their founder is in prison fighting extradition, they still managed to do this work and of crucial importance.
Which is very brave, because it certainly did not win them any additional friends in Washington at a time when they could use all the support they can, because Trump's administration is going after Julian Assange. But they still publish this, which is very brave. So the minimum outlets can do is acknowledge its existence. That's the minimum outlets can do. And I hope that they finally break the media blockade, because this story is just so important.
All right. Well, thank you, Aaron, for joining. Again, your host of the Pushback show for the Grayzone. And for those who watch this week, the Unauthorized Disclosure, if you go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure, become a subscriber, you can support this independent show. And I echo and agree entirely with Aaron, who says support independent media, whether it's the Grayzone, Rania, Khalek, the work that I do at Shadowproof, individual journalists, any journalists that are...
Kevin, by the way, let me say thank you for all the work you've done covering Assange. It was critical. You did the job that so many other journalists should have been doing if they cared about the profession, and you do. And what you did was a real service to all of us. And so I'm one of many people who really, really appreciate it. So thank you for what you did.
And I'll just add that I had the opportunity to talk with your colleagues, Max and Ben, about this trial earlier on in it. There were significant developments that hadn't happened, although to Max's credit, the work that the Grayzone has done on the UC Global spying operation against Assange with the support of, we believe, the CIA, there wasn't a whole lot that came out of the trial. In fact, I'd say Max and then really Max and El País are the two outlets that have like set the standard for what we understand about what's happened. So that just shows you the power of independent media when they cover and engage with this. And by the way, a lot of, just to be clear, everyone has these documents in this is an interesting like media example, because every outlet was granted an opportunity to have access to these documents. And we know what CNN did with them. They made up, they fabricated a story about Assange helping Russia out of these documents related to the spying that went against him, which is in line with the theme of our discussions. So
that was a bullshit story. I remember that. I covered that with Fidel Navarez, who was a diplomat in the consulate, in the Ecuadorian consulate, who just destroyed that story. It was so ridiculous. And that's a case of CNN acting as a arm of the CIA. It was shameful. Kevin, I got to go. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Signing off. Thank you. And everyone, if you go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure, you can support this podcast. We'll be back next week with another episode.